"Get out of my family's house!" Mark Sterling shouted, seizing Elena by the arm and dragging her across the ballroom floor while 300 guests watched in stunned silence. He snatched the envelope from his jacket and slammed it against her chest. "Sign it, right now, in front of everyone." Beatrice Sterling stepped forward, lifted Elena's gift from the table, and dropped it to the floor like trash. "You were never one of us," she said. "You never will be." Mark had just destroyed the one woman who held the deed to his house, the debt on his company, and the future of everything he believed he owned. If you have ever watched someone destroy a good woman in public and called it strength, stay with me. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Sterling estate had never looked more magnificent than it did that evening. Every chandelier blazed at full brilliance. The catering staff moved through the crowd with practiced silence, balancing trays of champagne and miniature crab cakes and tiny towers of smoked salmon on rye. String quartet music drifted from the far end of the ballroom, elegant and forgettable. The kind of music chosen not because anyone loved it, but because it announced to every guest that the family hosting them had impeccable taste. 300 people had come to celebrate Beatrice Sterling's 65th birthday. Politicians, financiers, socialites whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of New York and Boston and Washington, old money and new money, shaking hands, clinking glasses, measuring one another in the way that people who have always had too much measure everyone around them. Elena Sterling stood near the far edge of the room and felt none of it. She had learned in 4 years of marriage to Mark Sterling how to be invisible inside a crowd, how to smile at the right moment, how to nod when Beatrice spoke, how to shrink just enough that no one felt threatened by her presence, because the Sterling family had made clear from the very beginning that Elena Vance, the quiet woman their son had brought home from a research conference 3 months into a whirlwind courtship, was not what they had wanted for him. She was too plain, too quiet, too ordinary. She didn't come from a family with a name anyone recognized. Her clothes were good, but not extravagant. She drove a modest car. She took public transit sometimes, which Beatrice had mentioned exactly once at a dinner party, and never needed to mention again, because the look on the faces of every guest in that room had said everything Beatrice needed to say without another word. Tonight, Elena wore a dress the color of deep-water navy, almost black, understated, and well-cut. Her hair was pinned back simply. She wore no statement jewelry, just a single pearl drop on each ear that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked by every metric the Sterling family used to judge women in this room like someone who did not quite belong. She had grown accustomed to that feeling. She had in fact chosen it. But tonight was different. She could feel it before anything happened. The air in the room had a particular charge, the way the atmosphere changes before a storm, when the pressure drops and the light goes slightly wrong. Mark had barely spoken to her since they arrived. His mother had greeted her at the door with a look that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long and contained something Elena had not seen before. Not contempt exactly, which was Beatrice's usual register, but anticipation. Something had been decided. Elena understood that much. Something had been decided without her. She kept her composure. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She moved through the room with the measured calm she had spent 4 years perfecting, stopping to speak to a few of the guests she genuinely liked. Thomas Hargrove, the retired architect who always asked her thoughtful questions about the books she read. Patricia Veen, whose charity work Elena had quietly supported for 2 years without ever attaching her name to it. She found the present table near the back wall, set her gift among the others, and stood back. It was a book. A first-edition collection of botanical illustrations from 1887, sourced through a private dealer Elena had spent 3 months tracking down because she knew, or had once believed she knew, that Beatrice Sterling had a genuine love for antique natural history. She had paid more for that book than anyone in this room would guess, far more, because Elena understood the value of rare things in ways that had nothing to do with their price tags. She had simply never found a way to explain that to the Sterling family. She was still standing there when Claudia Marsh found her. Claudia was the wife of Mark's oldest friend, Derek Marsh, and she was not a malicious woman by nature. But she was a woman who ran on social information the way an engine runs on fuel, and tonight she was running hot. "Elena," she said, touching her arm, leaning in with the particular intimacy of someone about to deliver information they believe you need. "Are you all right? You look a little pale." "I'm fine," Elena said. "It's a lovely party." Claudia searched her face for a moment. Something passed behind her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Of course it is." She moved away without finishing whatever she had come to say, and Elena watched her go with the quiet attention she applied to most things in her life. Something was wrong. The information was in every interaction she'd had tonight, in every glance that slid away a beat too quickly, in every conversation that paused when she approached and resumed the moment she left. She found Mark 20 minutes later on the other side of the room, standing with his brother Richard and two men she didn't recognize, broad-suited with the particular stillness of people paid to be quiet. Legal people, she thought, or financial. She had spent enough time around both to know the posture. Mark saw her coming. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, more like impatience, the expression of a man who has decided on a course of action and resents any delay to its execution. "Elena," he said. "Mark." She looked at him steadily. "Are you enjoying the evening? We need to talk." "Then let's find somewhere quiet." "No." He said it with a flatness that stopped her. "Here is fine." She looked at him for a long moment, then at Richard, who was looking at the floor, then at the two suited men who were looking at nothing. "Mark," she said quietly, "what is this?" He reached inside his jacket, and the envelope came out. It was cream-colored, thick official, the kind of envelope that contained a document someone had paid lawyers a great deal of money to prepare. He held it out toward her, and his expression did not change at all. "I want a divorce," he said. "My family and I have discussed it at length. You've never fit into this life, Elena. You've never tried to fit. You're not the right partner for where this family needs to go, and I think we both know that." The room had not gone quiet. The music was still playing, but Elena was aware with the precise social radar she had developed over 4 years in this family that the people nearest to them had stopped moving. Glasses held halfway to lips, conversations trailing off, the particular quality of a crowd becoming an audience. "You want to do this here," she said, "tonight. I think it's cleaner this way. No drawn-out process, no drama." "No drama," she repeated, and something very small shifted in her expression. Not pain, not anger, something quieter and more dangerous than either. "You're serving me divorce papers at your mother's birthday party, Mark, in front of 300 people. My lawyers have been fair. You'll receive—" "I don't want to hear what your lawyers have been." She kept her voice low. She kept it entirely steady. "I want to hear you tell me what you think I am to you. After 4 years, I want to hear you say it." He straightened. He had the height advantage, and he used it the way he always did when he wanted to feel more certain than he was. "You are a woman who was never meant for this life," he said, "and the kindest thing I can do is end it now before it gets worse for both of us." "Mark." That was Beatrice's voice, and it came with the particular carrying power of a woman who has spent 65 years knowing how to fill a room. She was crossing toward them with Richard at her side, and behind her, Elena could see the small audience had grown. "Give her the papers. Let's get this done." She arrived at her son's shoulder and looked at Elena with an expression that Elena had catalogued hundreds of times over 4 years. It was the look of a woman who has already won and wants you to understand that she knows it. "You've been a placeholder, dear," Beatrice said pleasantly. "A charming little interlude, but Mark has a future ahead of him that requires a certain caliber of partner, and I think we have all known for some time that you simply don't have what it takes. It's not an insult. It's just the truth." "The book," someone said from somewhere behind Beatrice, and there was a small ripple of laughter that Elena didn't try to locate. "The gift table. They'd been looking at her gift." "Is that really a book?" Claudia's voice not cruel but unable to help itself. "For Beatrice's birthday. A book, an old one apparently." That was someone else. Male, young, amused. "Some kind of garden thing." More laughter. Not the whole room. Most of the people in that room were too well-bred or too uncertain to laugh openly. But enough to make it real. Elena stood in the center of it and did not move. Beatrice let the moment sit for exactly as long as she wanted it to, and then she said, "The gift is very you, Elena. It really is. Sweet, well-meaning, and entirely missing the point." Mark pushed the envelope slightly toward her. "Just sign it." She looked at him. She looked at his mother. She looked at Richard, who was still looking at the floor, and would, she noted, not look up for the rest of this conversation. She looked at the two suited men who were witnesses she now understood brought specifically for this purpose. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the morning she had walked into that research conference in Chicago and met a man who seemed in those first extraordinary weeks to see something in her that she hadn't expected anyone to see. She thought about the choice she had made a year into their relationship, deliberate, conscious, careful to test that perception, to stay quiet about who she was, to give him every chance to love her without the weight of what she had built. She thought about all the evidence she had accumulated in 4 years that told her quietly and consistently that the man standing in front of her had never actually looked at her at all. She took the envelope. She opened it. She read it with the focused speed of someone who processes legal documents the way other people skim menus. She found the relevant lines. She looked at the settlement figure her husband's lawyers had determined was fair compensation for 4 years of her life. She almost smiled. She reached into her small clutch purse and removed a pen, a simple pen, unremarkable, the kind of pen a woman like the one she had been performing for 4 years would carry. She uncapped it. She signed on the indicated line. She capped the pen. She handed the envelope back to Mark. He blinked. He had expected something different. Tears, perhaps, or argument, or the kind of desperate negotiation that would give him the satisfaction of knowing she needed him. "That's it," he said. "That's it," Elena said. She picked up her purse. She straightened her dress. She looked at Beatrice Sterling one more time and held the woman's gaze for exactly long enough to make Beatrice feel, for perhaps the first time in this entire exchange, slightly uncertain. "Thank you for the party," Elena said. "The flowers were beautiful." She walked toward the door. The crowd parted. Not with respect, she was under no illusions about that. With the particular discomfort of people who have watched something happen and are not entirely sure how to classify what they saw. The music continued. A waiter moved past her with a tray. She walked through the main door, through the receiving hall, through the grand entryway with its imported marble floors and its portrait of the Sterling patriarch above the fireplace, and out through the front door into the night air. It was raining, a soft spring rain, the kind that is more atmosphere than storm. She stood on the top step of the Sterling estate and felt it against her face, and for a long moment she simply stood there breathing. A car idled at the bottom of the drive, not a cab. Her car, the modest one, the one she drove because she had made a decision 4 years ago about what kind of woman she was going to be inside this particular story. Her phone was in her hand. She hadn't reached for it consciously. She was looking at it the way you look at a tool you've been waiting a long time to use. She opened a contact labeled simply GH and pressed call. It rang once. "Ms. Vance," said the voice on the other end. Not Mrs. Sterling, not Elena. Ms. Vance, because the man on the other end of this call had been waiting with the patience of someone well compensated for patience for exactly this moment. "Jeffrey," Elena said. "It's done." A brief pause. "The timeline we discussed. Begin Monday." She looked back once at the lights blazing in the Sterling estate windows. The party was continuing. Of course it was. She had never been important enough to stop a party. "Pull everything forward. I want the full picture on the table within 60 days. "Understood." Another pause. "And the debt holdings. All of them," she said. "Every note. Every instrument. I want it structured and documented before the end of the quarter." "It will be done." She ended the call. She walked down the steps to her car. The driver held the door, and she slid inside without a word, and the car moved quietly down the long driveway between the rows of perfectly maintained oaks that lined the Sterling property, and out through the iron gates and into the ordinary world beyond. Inside the car in the dark, she let out one slow breath. Not grief, not relief exactly, something more precise than either, the feeling of a woman who has been carrying a particular weight for a very long time and has just at last set it down. She looked out the window at the rain-blurred city lights sliding past, and she was already thinking forward. already calculating, already seeing with the clarity that had built the life she had deliberately hidden for 4 years exactly what came next. She was Elena Vance, not Elena Sterling, not Mark's wife, not Beatrice's placeholder, or the quiet woman with the inappropriate birthday gift, or the target of 300 people's whispered amusement. Elena Vance, founder, architect, owner of a private equity empire that had been operating quietly and systematically for 11 years across 14 countries, and a portfolio so diversified, so deliberately structured, that most of the financial world still did not fully understand who was behind it. Jeffrey Harmon had been her chief operating officer for 8 of those 11 years. The contact list on her phone, the real phone, the one she kept in a small locked compartment in the armrest of this very car, contained numbers that the Sterling family, with all their old money and their social connections and their deep conviction that they understood power, had never encountered and likely never would. She had chosen Mark Sterling in a moment of genuine feeling. She wanted to be clear about that to herself even now. She had not set out to construct a trap. She had met a man who seemed to her in those first weeks to possess something rare, a genuine curiosity, a warmth that didn't feel performed, a way of listening that made her feel seen rather than assessed. She had tested that perception carefully. She had presented herself as ordinary because she needed to know if ordinary was enough. She had watched him for a year before she made the choice to become Elena Sterling and put away Elena Vance. She had given him 4 years. She had her answer now. She had gotten it in the clearest possible way, in the most public possible setting, with witnesses and paperwork and her own signature on the line. The car reached her building, not the apartment everyone associated with her cover identity, but the building she actually lived in, the one registered to a corporate holding company, the one that most of the people who had laughed at her tonight would never have any reason to visit. She rode the elevator up in silence. Her assistant Maya was waiting in the main room with a tablet and a look of controlled fury that she had clearly been suppressing for some time. Maya had always known who Elena was. Maya had also always hated the Sterling cover with a professional's contempt for unnecessary risk. "I saw the alert from Jeffrey," Maya said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Are you actually fine, or are you fine the way you say fine when you mean that you're already 20 steps ahead and you just don't want to discuss feelings right now?" Elena looked at her assistant for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "The second one," she said. Maya nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because the board is going to want a briefing on timeline, and I need about 45 minutes from you to consolidate the Sterling debt documentation before Monday. You'll have it." Elena moved to the window. The city spread out below her in the rain lights, blurring and multiplying in the wet streets. She had built this view, not literally, but in every way that mattered. She had built the fortune that paid for the perspective and the quiet and the distance between her and whatever the Sterling family was doing right now at that party, laughing about the book, relieved to have cut her loose. They thought they had freed themselves. She thought about Beatrice Sterling's face when she'd said placeholder. She thought about the way Richard had studied the floor. She thought about Mark, the flatness of his voice, the way he'd said the kindest thing I can do, as though he were performing a mercy rather than making the worst miscalculation of his life. She thought about the debt instruments Jeffrey was preparing. Sterling Textiles had been bleeding for 3 years. The family knew it, though they had worked hard to conceal it from their social circle. What they did not know, what they could not know, because the structure Elena had built was specifically designed to be invisible, was that the primary holder of their consolidated debt was a subsidiary of a company that reported ultimately to Vantage Global, to Elena. She owned their debt, had owned it for 2 years, accumulating it patiently and quietly through instruments designed to look like ordinary market activity. She owned notes on their manufacturing facilities. She held instruments tied to their distribution contracts. She had 6 months ago completed the acquisition of a small regional bank that held the mortgage on the Sterling family home, the estate where the party was still happening right now, where the champagne was still flowing and the string quartet was still playing, and 300 people were still marveling at the audacity of a woman who had given Beatrice Sterling a book. The house, the company, the debt, all of it ran through channels that led quietly and inevitably back to her. She had not built this position for revenge. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, because she had always believed that honesty about motivation was the difference between a person who acted with integrity and a person who simply told themselves a flattering story. She had built this position because Sterling Textiles was a struggling company in a sector she understood well, and because the opportunity had been there, and because she was Elena Vance. And Elena Vance did not leave value on the table out of sentiment. But she would be lying to herself if she said the knowledge hadn't been a comfort. In the difficult years in the evenings when she sat at dinner in the Sterling house and absorbed Beatrice's particular brand of gentle dismissal in the mornings when she caught Mark looking at her with the expression of a man recalculating a decision he'd already made on all those occasions, the knowledge that she held the foundation of this family's world in the same quiet hands they'd dismissed had been something she returned to. Not with malice, with a kind of settled patience. She turned from the window. "Monday," she said to Maya. "Start the clock." Maya was already typing. Elena sat down in the chair she actually used in the apartment she actually lived in the life she had built with her own hands and her own mind over 11 years of work that the Sterling family had never once thought to ask her about because she had been to them always and only a placeholder. She opened her real phone. She looked at the contact list. She thought about 60 days in boardrooms and the particular expression on a powerful person's face when they walk into a room expecting salvation and find instead reckoning. She thought about the book she had given Beatrice, a first edition, 1887, genuine botanical illustrations, hand-colored, one of fewer than 12 copies known to exist, worth at current auction estimates somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. They had laughed at the book. She thought about that, and the corner of her mouth moved again, and this time it was something that in other circumstances, on another woman's face, might have looked like a smile. Outside, the rain was still falling. Inside, Elena Vance was already at work. The car moved through the rain, and Elena did not look back. That was the first thing Maya noticed when she reviewed the building's entrance footage the following morning. Not that Elena arrived at 11:47 at night with rain on her dress and a signed divorce agreement in her purse, but that she had not once turned to look behind her, not at the gate, not at the street, not at anything. She walked from the car to the elevator with the focused forward momentum of a woman who had already finished grieving something a long time ago and was now simply moving on to the next task. Maya had worked for Elena Vance for 6 years. She had learned in those 6 years to read the difference between Elena's silences. There was the silence of calculation, which was her most common register. Quick, dense, layered the silence of a mind processing more information than most people generated in a week. There was the silence of patience, which was rarer and more dangerous, the particular stillness of a woman who had decided to wait. And then there was the silence Maya had heard only twice before in 6 years. The silence that had no name for it, except the one Maya used privately, which was the silence of arrival. The silence of a woman who had finally reached the place she had been moving toward all along. That was the silence Elena carried into the apartment that night. "Jeffrey has the documentation ready," Maya said, handing her a tablet without preamble, because Elena did not want preamble. "The Sterling debt consolidation is clean. All instruments are held through the Luxembourg vehicle, which routes through the Singapore Trust, which reports to Vantage Global's primary holding structure. There is no visible thread. No journalist, no lawyer, no forensic accountant hired by the Sterling family could trace it in less than 8 months. And by 8 months, it will no longer matter." Elena scrolled through the documentation without sitting down. The family home mortgage held by Caldwell Regional Bank since last October. Caldwell was acquired by a Vantage subsidiary in February. The Sterlings received the standard notification letter about the acquisition. It is filed, I am certain, somewhere in Richard Sterling's office under a stack of things he meant to review and did not. And the manufacturing facilities. 3 of the 4 primary facilities carry debt instruments we now hold outright. The 4th has a partial position, 62%. The remaining 38% is held by a pension fund that has been trying to quietly exit the position for 14 months. Jeffrey has been in conversation with their representative. We expect to close on the remainder within 30 days. Elena set the tablet down. She stood at the window and looked at the city and said nothing for a moment. Maya waited. "The party is still going," Elena said. It wasn't a question. Maya checked her phone. Social media suggests it ran until approximately midnight. Several guests posted photographs. She paused. You appeared in 2 of them. Background. One of the captions describes the evening as, quote, perfectly wonderful. Elena turned from the window. There was something in her expression that Maya had learned not to misread. It was not bitterness, and it was not satisfaction, and it existed in the precise space between the two where a woman lives when she has spent 4 years watching people underestimate her and has finally irrevocably decided to stop allowing it. Monday, Elena said. Full team, 8 o'clock. Already scheduled. And get me everything we have on Sterling Textile's current board composition. I want to know who has been paying attention and who has been collecting a check. Maya was already writing. Elena picked up her real phone, the one that mattered, and walked to the room at the end of the hall that served as her actual office, the one behind the door that looked to anyone who might have occasion to observe it like a linen closet. She closed the door. She sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop. She worked until 4 in the morning. Across the city in the Sterling estate, the last guests were departing, and Mark Sterling was standing in the emptied ballroom with a glass of bourbon and the particular expression of a man who has done something he told himself was necessary and is now in the quiet aftermath, not entirely certain what he feels about it. His mother found him there. "Stop that," Beatrice said, reading him the way she had always read him, too accurately, too quickly, with too little sympathy for the complexity of what she saw. "You look like a man with regrets, and you have nothing to regret. You made the right call." "She signed it," Mark said. "She didn't even argue." "Of course she didn't. What argument did she have? She had nothing. Mark, she came into this family with nothing. She contributed nothing, and she has left with a settlement that is frankly more generous than she deserved. It's done. She wasn't—" He stopped. "She wasn't what—" He turned the glass in his hand. "She wasn't what you always said she was, Mother. She was never stupid. She was never weak. I always knew that." Beatrice made a sound that was not quite impatience and not quite contempt. Intelligence and weakness are not the only measures of a woman's fitness for this family. She had no ambition, no connections, no understanding of what this life requires. "She understood everything," Mark said quietly. "That was always what bothered me about her. She understood everything, and she never seemed to need anything from it. From us. From me." He took a drink. "I used to think that was a flaw. Now I'm not sure what it was." Beatrice looked at her son for a moment with the assessment of a woman who has managed a family and a social position and a declining fortune for 30 years and has learned that sentiment is a luxury the Sterling name could no longer afford. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have a meeting with the bank on Thursday. Focus on that." She left him there. He stood in the empty ballroom for a long time after she was gone, and the thing he kept returning to the image he could not move past was Elena's face when she had signed the papers. Not what he had expected, not tears, not anger, not the desperate negotiating he had steeled himself against. Just that look, steady and quiet and containing something he could not name, something that had looked unsettlingly like a woman finishing a calculation she had been working on for a very long time. He told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. Monday arrived with the precision of something that had been planned in detail, which it had. At 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, whose lobby directory listed a dozen different companies and mentioned Vantage Global nowhere. Elena Vance walked into a conference room and sat at the head of a table where 9 people were already waiting. She had not slept enough. No one looking at her would have known it. "The Sterling position," she said without greeting, because this team did not require greeting. They required direction, and Elena Vance had always understood the difference. Jeffrey, status. Jeffrey Harmon was 51, gray-haired, and possessed of the particular competence that comes from a decade of executing complex financial strategy for a principal who demands precision and punishes approximation. He opened his folder. Full debt consolidation complete as of Friday evening. Total exposure across all instruments is $412 million. Manufacturing debt distribution contract instruments and the residential mortgage on the primary family property. We hold it cleanly through the Luxembourg structure. Equity position in the operating company. We hold no direct equity. We hold debt with covenant triggers that give us effective control if the company breaches. Current trajectory. He checked his page, suggests breach within 90 to 120 days without intervention. And they know this. Their CFO knows the company is in distress. Their board knows the company is in distress. What they do not know is the identity of their consolidated creditor. They believe their debt is distributed across 4 separate institutional holders. "Who are all ours?" said the woman to Jeffrey's left, Christine Park Vantage's head of structured finance, who had designed the holding architecture with a precision that Elena had approved and admired in equal measure. "All ours," Jeffrey confirmed. Elena looked around the table. "I want a meeting convened, 60 days. We invite the Sterling Board and family principals to Vantage Global for what they will be told is a creditor restructuring discussion. They will come expecting a negotiation. They will come expecting to ask for an extension, perhaps for favorable terms, perhaps for a partial debt forgiveness in exchange for equity." She paused. "They will not know who they are meeting until they are in the room." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Christine said carefully, "Elena, is that the play you want to make the personal dimension?" "Has nothing to do with it," Elena said. "This is a sound financial position executed through legal instruments on a standard timeline. The fact that I was previously married to one of the principals is a detail. It does not change the structure. It does not change the strategy." Christine held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. 60 days, Elena said. "Build the meeting, and I want a full briefing package prepared everything we know about Sterling Textile's current operational state, their board's internal communications to the extent we have them, and their financial projections. I want to walk into that room knowing more about their company than they do." "You already do," Jeffrey said. "Then I want it documented." The meeting ran for 3 hours. When it was over and the team had filed out with their assignments, Maya stayed behind. She sat across from Elena in the emptying room and looked at her with the directness that Elena had always valued in her above all other qualities. "How are you?" Maya said. "Not how is the plan. How are you?" Elena considered the question with the same attention she gave to everything. "I am—" She stopped, started again. "I spent 4 years in a life I constructed to answer a question. The question has been answered. That is clarifying. It's not painless, but it's clarifying. The question being whether he could love you without knowing who you were. The question being whether the person I saw in him in the beginning was real." She looked at the table. "It wasn't, or it was real and it wasn't durable. I'm not sure which is worse." Maya said nothing. She had learned in 6 years when Elena needed space in a conversation. "He said I never fit," Elena said. "His mother called me a placeholder." She looked up. 4 years of my life, and what they saw was a woman who gave someone a book for their birthday and wore the wrong earrings. "They saw what you let them see." "I know." A pause. "That was supposed to make it feel like power, and it mostly did, except in the moments when it felt like the loneliest thing I have ever done." The silence stretched between them, honest and unperformed. Then Elena straightened. She pulled her laptop toward her. "The philanthropic board meeting is Wednesday. I want the education initiative proposal finalized before then, and I need 30 minutes with legal today about the Chicago acquisition. The timeline slipped, and I want to understand why." Maya stood, recognizing the shift, the re-engagement, the return to forward motion. "I'll set it up." At the door she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "the book you gave her was worth more than everything on that gift table combined." Elena looked at her. "I know," she said. "That was the point." Maya left. Elena opened her laptop and went back to work. 3 weeks after the gala, Mark Sterling sat across from the bank officer who managed Sterling Textile's primary credit facility and listened to language he had been afraid to hear for 2 years. "The covenant threshold," the officer said with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he did not create and did not enjoy delivering, "has been breached on 2 of the 4 instruments. We are obligated under the terms of the original agreements to notify you formally and request a remediation plan within 45 days. Mark's lawyer seated beside him made a note. "Who holds the instruments?" Mark asked. "Institutional holders, 4 separate entities. I want names. The officer looked briefly uncomfortable. I can provide the formal notification documentation, which will include, I want names today. Mr. Sterling, the entities in question hold through structured vehicles, which means you don't actually know, Mark said. The officer said nothing, which was its own answer. Mark drove back to the estate in silence. His brother Richard was waiting for him in the study, which meant Richard had already heard, which meant the leak in their organization was exactly where Mark had suspected it was for 6 months and had been too distracted to address. How bad? Richard said. Bad. Mark sat down. $400 million in consolidated debt on a company doing $60 million in annual revenue. We are 3 months from technical insolvency if nothing changes. Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, we need a restructuring partner, someone with capital who understands the sector. I know. I've had 3 conversations over the past 2 months. One firm in particular, they seem to know our situation in considerable detail, almost. Richard paused, frowning at the shape of the thought before he said it. Almost more than they should, given that we haven't shared our financials with them. Which firm? Richard checked his phone. The meeting was arranged through a third party. The firm presenting is called Vantage something. Vantage Global, I think. Sci-si. Mark's expression did not change. The name meant nothing to him. In his world, the world of regional textile manufacturing, an inherited social position and Boston banking relationships built over 3 generations, the name Vantage Global did not land with any particular weight. He had never had occasion to look it up. He had never had reason to. Set the meeting, he said. Richard nodded. Already in progress. They've proposed a formal presentation in 60 days. Their office is in New York. Fine. Mark looked out the window at the grounds of the estate at the Oaks and the manicured lawn and the house that had been in his family for 40 years. We go to New York, we listen to what they have, we negotiate. That's what we do. He believed with the confidence of a man who had always eventually found a way through that this was still a situation that could be managed. That somewhere at the end of this particular road was a deal that preserved enough of what his family had built to make the story come out right. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Across those 60 days, Elena moved. She moved the way she had always moved when she was operating in her real life, not with the quiet containment she had performed for 4 years in the Sterling house, but with the full concentrated force of a mind that had been trained on complexity and had never once shrunk from it. She reviewed every document in the Sterling Textiles file. She walked through the operational analysis with Christine. She spent an afternoon with the restructuring specialist her team had brought in, going line by line through the company's cost structure and identifying precisely what could be saved and what was simply gone. She had built Vantage Global from a 2-person advisory firm into a multi-billion-dollar private equity operation in 11 years. She had done it through a combination of analytical precision, strategic patience, and a willingness to move decisively when other people were still debating. She had done it while presenting to the world, in certain carefully maintained contexts, the version of herself that the world found easiest to dismiss. She was done with that version now. On the 59th day, she sat in her office until 11 at night, reviewing the final briefing package. Every number, every contract, every instrument, the Sterling family home, the manufacturing facilities, the distribution agreements, the pension fund position, they had finally closed on all of it, documented, structured, clean. She read it the way she read everything, completely carefully, with the specific attention of a woman who understood that the difference between power and the appearance of power was the absence of surprises. There were no surprises. She closed the folder. She sat back. She thought briefly about the woman she had been 4 years ago at a research conference in Chicago, sitting across a dinner table from a man who had made her feel for the first time in a long time like someone was genuinely curious about who she was. She thought about the hope in that. She did not try to talk herself out of the reality of the hope, because she had never believed in pretending that things that mattered hadn't mattered. They had mattered. Mark Sterling had mattered. The marriage had mattered. And he had thrown it across a ballroom floor and told her to pick it up. She thought about Beatrice calling her a placeholder. She thought about 300 people laughing at the book. She thought about this book, that beautiful, meticulous, extraordinary 1887 first edition that she had spent 3 months sourcing, and that Beatrice had left, as far as Elena had been able to determine, sitting on the gift table while the caterers packed up. She thought about all of it quietly and without flinching, in the way that she had always made peace with difficult things, by looking at them directly until they lost the power to surprise her. Then she closed her laptop. She went to bed. She slept soundly. Tomorrow was the meeting. Tomorrow the chair at the head of the Vantage Global boardroom table would turn, and Mark Sterling would see the face of the woman he had humiliated in front of 300 people and called a burden and told to leave with nothing. And everything would change. The morning of the meeting, Mark Sterling woke up at 5:45 and could not go back to sleep. He lay in the dark of his bedroom in the Sterling estate and stared at the ceiling and told himself what he had been telling himself for 60 days, that this was a negotiation that he was good at, negotiations that the Sterling name still carried weight in rooms where weight mattered, and that whatever firm had accumulated their debt had done so because they saw value in the underlying business, which meant they wanted a deal, which meant there was a deal to be made. He had made himself believe this. He had worked at it the way he worked at most uncomfortable things, by repeating the most favorable interpretation until it felt like fact. He showered, dressed in his best suit, and drove to the city with Richard in the passenger seat and their lawyer, Franklin Brace, in the back. Franklin had been the Sterling family's primary legal counsel for 11 years. He was thorough, experienced, and deeply loyal to the family, which were 3 qualities Mark valued, and one quality, thoroughness, that was about to become a source of considerable pain. Because Franklin had in the past 2 weeks done what Mark had not thought to do 60 days ago. He had researched Vantage Global. He had started the research as a routine due diligence exercise and had quickly discovered that Vantage Global was not the mid-sized restructuring firm he had assumed it was. It was one of the largest private equity operations in the world. Multi-billion-dollar portfolio. 14 countries. A reputation in financial circles for precision, strategic patience, and an almost unsettling tendency to accumulate positions in distressed companies with such discretion that the companies in question rarely understood what was happening until it had already happened. He had found all of this out 48 hours ago. He had not told Mark yet because he had needed 2 days to process the implications himself, and because he had a deeply uncomfortable feeling about those implications that he had not yet found the words for. He found them now in the car 20 minutes from the city. "Mark," Franklin said, "I need to tell you something about this firm before we go in." Mark looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Now you're telling me now. I finished the research 2 days ago. I needed time to verify." "Verify what?" Franklin opened his folder. Vantage Global manages approximately $47 billion in assets across 14 jurisdictions. They are not a restructuring firm. They are a private equity empire. They do not typically take meetings with companies of Sterling Textiles' size unless— He stopped. Unless what, Franklin? Unless they already own the outcome. The car was quiet for a moment. Richard turned in his seat. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Franklin said carefully, "that I believe the 4 institutional holders of your consolidated debt are not 4 separate entities. I believe they are 4 vehicles controlled by a single entity. I believe that entity is Vantage Global." He paused. "I believe we have been consolidating toward a single creditor without knowing it, and I believe that creditor has known everything about our financial position for considerably longer than we have." Mark's hands tightened on the wheel. "Who runs Vantage Global?" Franklin looked at his folder. "The company is privately held. The founding principal is identified in public filings as E. Vance." He hesitated. "The full name appears in one regulatory filing from 11 years ago. Elena Vance." The car went completely silent. Richard said, That has to be a coincidence. That's a common enough—" "It is not a coincidence," Franklin said quietly. "I ran the biographical data. Elena Vance, founder of Vantage Global, age 38, previously based in Chicago. Previous name—" He stopped again. "Say it," Mark said. His voice had gone very flat. "Previous legal name, Elena Sterling. Married 4 years, divorced 61 days ago." Nobody spoke for a very long time. Richard was the first to find words, and what he said was, "Turn the car around." "We can't turn the car around," Mark said. "Mark, if she owns our debt, then she owns our debt whether we go to this meeting or not. Turning the car around changes nothing except that we miss the only opportunity we have to sit across from her and understand what she intends to do with it." He was driving with a steadiness that cost him something that took everything he had, because underneath the steadiness, something enormous and terrible was rearranging itself in his chest. "We go to the meeting." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "You knew," he said. "When you saw that name just now, you didn't look surprised." "I didn't know," Mark said. "But He stopped. He thought about Elena signing the papers without argument. He thought about the look on her face. He thought about 4 years of a woman who never seemed to need anything from his family's world, who watched everything and said little, and understood he had always sensed far more than she ever chose to show. "I should have known," he said. "That's different." They drove the rest of the way in silence. The Vantage Global offices occupied 4 floors of a midtown building that announced its own importance through the specific restraint of its design. Nothing excessive, nothing showy, just quality so thorough and so consistent that it created its own gravity. The lobby desk staff were polished and unhurried. The elevator was fast and silent. The receptionist on the 43rd floor greeted them by name, offered coffee with the warmth of someone who genuinely meant it, and asked them to wait in the anteroom adjoining the main boardroom. They waited for 11 minutes. Mark counted them. He sat in a chair that probably cost more than his first car, and looked at his hands and counted 11 minutes and thought about Elena Vance, who had been Elena Sterling, and who had apparently been building a $47 billion empire during the 4 years he had spent telling his mother she didn't fit. Franklin leaned over and said quietly, "Whatever happens in there, do not make commitments without my explicit approval. If she's holding what I think she's holding, our negotiating position is non-existent," Mark said. Franklin didn't correct him. At the 11-minute mark, a woman opened the boardroom door. Young, precise, with a tablet under one arm, and the expression of someone who managed an extraordinary amount of complexity and had made peace with that fact. She said, Mr. Sterling, Mr. Brace, they're ready for you." They walked in. The boardroom was long, with a table that seated 20 and windows that looked out over the city at a height that made the city look like something you could pick up and rearrange. 9 people were seated on the far side of the table, finance people, legal people, the particular mix of expertise that assembled around a major transaction. Papers were laid out, water was poured. Everything was prepared with the meticulous attention of a team that had been preparing for this meeting for a very long time. The chair at the head of the table had its back to the door. Mark saw it immediately. The single chair slightly turned away, the only person in the room not facing the entrance. He felt something cold move through him, recognition of a staging, a deliberate choice, a moment that had been designed. Franklin touched his arm and they sat. The room was quiet. One of the Vantage team members, a gray-haired man with a calm that read as absolute authority, said, "Thank you for coming. Before we begin, our principal would like to address you directly." The chair turned, and there she was. Elena Vance sat at the head of the table in a suit the color of charcoal, her hair down in a way she had never worn it in the Sterling house, and she looked at Mark Sterling with an expression that contained no anger, no satisfaction, no performance of any kind. She looked at him the way she had always looked at everything, with a clarity so complete it was almost impersonal. Mark felt the air leave his body. Richard made a sound that was not quite a word. Franklin, to his considerable credit, said nothing at all. "Good morning," Elena said. Her voice was the same. That was the thing that hit Mark hardest in that first impossible moment. Her voice was exactly the same. Quiet, precise and containing as it always had the particular quality of a woman who said exactly what she meant, and nothing more. "I appreciate you making the trip." Mark found his voice somewhere. "Elena." "Ms. Vance," she said. Not unkindly, simply accurately. "In this room, it's Ms. Vance." Richard leaned toward Mark and said under his breath, "We need to—" "Sit down, Richard," Elena said without looking at him. "You haven't stood up." Richard sat back. Elena opened the folder in front of her with the efficiency of someone who had reviewed its contents many times and no longer needed to look at them to know what they said. I'll be direct, because I think directness is what this situation requires, and because I suspect you've had a difficult morning already. Your family's company carries $412 million in consolidated debt. That debt is held in its entirety by Vantage Global through 4 structured vehicles. She looked up. All 4 vehicles are mine. Franklin said, Ms. Vance, if we could, Mr. Brace. She said it pleasantly. I know who you are, and I know what you're about to say, and I need you to understand that this meeting is not a negotiation about whether those instruments exist or who holds them. It is a meeting about what happens next. You'll have time to speak. Please let me finish. Franklin sat back with the expression of a man who had just understood completely and finally the shape of the situation he was in. Elena continued, in addition to the debt position, Vantage Global holds the mortgage on the Sterling family estate through our acquisition of Caldwell Regional Bank in February of this year. That acquisition was publicly announced. You received notification. I have the delivery confirmation. A pause. The estate is effectively an asset held against debt obligations you are currently unable to service. Beatrice's voice would have filled this room, Mark thought randomly. His mother would have had something to say right now, some Beatrice Sterling response that deployed dignity like a weapon, and he almost wished she were here because he had nothing. He was sitting at this table with nothing, no leverage, no counter, no story to tell himself about how this came out right, and the woman across from him was the woman he had thrown divorce papers at in front of 300 people, and she was looking at him with that terrible quiet clarity, and he had absolutely nothing. Why? He said. The room shifted slightly. It was not the question anyone had expected. Elena looked at him. For the first time since the chair had turned, something moved in her expression, not softening exactly, but acknowledgement, as though the question deserved a different quality of response than the financial recitation. That's not the right question, she said. The right question is what happens now. I want to know why first. Mark. She said his name with a flatness that was not cruelty, but was its own kind of finality. I built Vantage Global over 11 years. I accumulated your company's debt because it was available, it was distressed, and it was a sound financial position. The fact that I was simultaneously your wife does not change the structure of the investment. It changes the, she paused, choosing the word, the optics. The optics, Richard said, and there was something in his voice that was almost a laugh, except that nothing in this room was funny. Elena Miss Vance, you were married to my brother while you were buying our company's debt. That's not optics. That's legal, Franklin said quietly. It is unfortunately entirely legal. I've already checked. He looked at Elena with the expression of a man surrendering a point he had hoped to hold. There is no instrument of the marriage that created disclosure obligations regarding independent business activities. The prenuptial agreement which I drafted myself specifically preserved financial independence for both parties. It did, Elena confirmed. You're a thorough lawyer, Mr. Brace. You protected Mark's assets carefully. You simply didn't consider that the asset requiring protection might be on the other side of the table. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Mark looked at his hands, then he looked up at Elena, and what he said next was not strategic, was not lawyered, was simply the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the car ride and needed to come out before anything else could happen. Did you ever actually love me? Or was I always just a position you were accumulating? Elena was quiet for a moment. The Vantage team around her went very still, with the professionalism of people who understood they were witnessing something that had moved outside the boundaries of the meeting they had prepared for. Yes, Elena said. I loved you. I want to be honest about that because I have always believed in honesty about things that matter. She held his gaze. I came into this marriage with genuine feeling, and I stayed in it for 4 years, hoping to be wrong about what I was seeing. I was not wrong. A pause. You want to ask me if the investment was revenge. It wasn't. It was what I do, what I have always done. You simply never asked. You never told me. No, she said. I didn't, because I needed to know if you could see me without knowing, and you couldn't. She closed the folder. That's the answer to your question. Now, what happens next? She reached to her left, and Jeffrey slid a document across the table toward the Sterling side. "Two options," Elena said. "The first option is a structured sale. Sterling Textiles transfers all operating assets to a Vantage Global subsidiary at a valuation we have determined is fair. I will tell you plainly that our valuation is more generous than market, because I have no interest in being accused of predatory terms. The family retains a small equity position in the successor entity, the debt is discharged, and the estate mortgage is restructured on terms that allow your mother to remain in the house for her lifetime." She let that land. "I am not trying to put your mother on the street, Mark. Whatever you think of me." Mark looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. "The second option," Elena continued, "is that you decline, in which case we move to formal enforcement. The debt instruments carry acceleration clauses that, given the existing covenant breaches, are already technically triggered. We could move to enforcement within 30 days. The manufacturing facilities would be liquidated. The distribution contracts would be assigned. The estate would enter foreclosure proceedings." She paused. "I do not want that outcome. It creates regulatory complexity, and it is bad for the employees of your company, none of whom are responsible for how this family managed its finances. But if you force it, I am prepared to execute it." Richard picked up this document. He read it faster than Mark would have expected. Richard had always been the quieter sibling, the one who sat in the background of Sterling family decisions, and it occurred to Mark now, with the particular clarity of catastrophic moments, that he had never actually known how much his brother paid attention. "The valuation," Richard said slowly, "this is above what we'd get in a distressed sale." "Yes," Elena said. "Why?" She looked at Richard with something that was almost warmth. "Because despite everything, I spent 4 years caring about this family. Not all of it equally. But the employees, the legacy of what your grandfather built before your father ran it into the ground. Those things are real, and they deserve to survive, even if the current ownership structure cannot." She sat back. "I am not your enemy, Richard. I am the person your family chose to discard, and I am also the person who currently holds the future of everything your family owns. Those two things are both true at the same time." Richard set the document down. He looked at his brother. Mark had not moved in several minutes. He was sitting with the particular stillness of a man whose entire understanding of his own story has just been rewritten in a single morning, and who does not yet have the language for what the new story is. Franklin reached over and picked up the document. He began reading it with the focused attention of a man doing the only useful thing he could still do in this room. Mark looked at Elena. He said, "The book." She looked at him. "The book you gave my mother. For her birthday." Something was working in his face. Not tears exactly, but the precursor to something. "Was it valuable?" Elena held his gaze. $40,000 to $60,000 at current auction. One of fewer than 12 copies known to exist. A pause. "I spent 3 months finding it because I believed your mother genuinely loved rare natural history, and I wanted to give her something real." Mark closed his eyes. He opened them. "She left it on the gift table. I know. She didn't—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "She didn't even look at it." "No." The room was very quiet. Franklin looked up from the document. "Mark, the terms are—" "I have to tell you honestly, the terms are as good as we are going to see. Better than we should expect." He took his glasses off. "I recommend you take the first option." Mark looked at his lawyer. He looked at his brother, who gave the smallest, most exhausted nod. He looked at the 9 Vantage Global people arranged on the other side of the table with their documents and their quiet competence. He looked at the window and the city beyond it, and he thought about 40 years of Sterling name and Sterling money, and his mother's voice telling him to focus on the meeting, and his own voice telling Elena in front of 300 people that she was a burden. He looked at Elena. She was waiting, not impatiently, not with satisfaction, with the steady, complete attention of a woman who had learned over many years that the most important quality in a difficult moment was the willingness to stay in it without flinching. "All right," Mark Sterling said. His voice was very quiet. "All right," he said again, as though saying it twice would help him believe it. "We'll take the first option." Elena nodded once. She looked at Jeffrey. "Prepare the execution documents." Jeffrey was already moving. The meeting that followed was 2 hours of legal language and signature lines, and Franklin asking questions that demonstrated his thoroughness even in defeat, and Richard sitting with his arms folded and the expression of a man rearranging his understanding of his own history. It was methodical and professional, and utterly without drama, because Elena Vance had always understood that the most powerful moments were the ones that didn't need to perform their own power. At the end of it, as the Vantage team gathered their materials, and Franklin spoke in low tones with the Vantage legal counsel about execution timelines, Mark found himself standing near the window with Elena at a distance of perhaps 6 feet, the closest they had been since the night in the ballroom, and he said the thing he had not said in the formal part of the meeting, the thing that had no place in a document but needed nevertheless to exist somewhere. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the way it happened. The papers in front of everyone, that was—" He stopped. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway because my mother wanted it done that way, and I wasn't strong enough to say no to her. I haven't been strong enough to say no to her about most things." He looked at the floor. "I don't think that's an excuse. I just think it's the truth." Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at him with the same steady attention she had brought to everything this morning, and Mark had the sense, as he had always had with her, that she was hearing not just his words, but everything underneath them. "I know," she said. "That's part of why I loved you. You were capable of seeing things clearly. You couldn't always act on what you saw." She picked up her folder. "I hope you learn how to. I think it would make you a better person. I think you have it in you to be a better person than you were in that ballroom." She said it without cruelty, without condescension, as a statement of honest assessment from a woman who had known him well and was not interested in either flattering him or destroying him more than the situation already had. She walked toward the door. At the threshold she paused, and without turning back she said, "The book, by the way, the botanical illustrations. If your mother doesn't want it, have her contact Maya. I'll have it returned to the collection it belongs to." And then she was gone. Mark stood at the window and looked at the city and understood with the slow and terrible clarity of a man waking from a very long sleep that the woman who had just methodically, legally, and with complete precision disassembled everything his family had spent 3 generations building was also the woman who had spent 3 months finding a rare book because she wanted to give his mother something real, and his mother had left it on the table. He understood something else too, something that would take him months to fully process, but that arrived now in its essential form, clean and unavoidable. The catastrophe of this morning had not begun 61 days ago when he served divorce papers at a birthday party. It had not begun 2 years ago when Sterling Textiles started bleeding. It had begun the first time he had looked at Elena Vance and seen instead of who she actually was, only what his family needed her to be. That was where he had lost her. Not in the ballroom, not with the papers. Long before either. The documents were signed by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Franklin Brace drove back to Boston in silence, which was unusual for a man who had spent 11 years as the Sterling family's primary legal voice and had almost never run out of things to say. Richard sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the highway unspooling behind them and thought about his grandfather, who had built Sterling Textiles from a single mill in western Massachusetts with his own hands and a borrowed loan, and the kind of stubborn, unromantic work ethic that the generation after him had admired without replicating. He thought about what his grandfather would have said about this afternoon. He decided his grandfather would not have said anything. His grandfather had been a man who believed that when you made a catastrophic mistake, the only dignified response was silence and correction in that order. Mark drove separately. He drove slowly, which was not like him taking the longer route through the city, without consciously deciding to moving through the late afternoon traffic with the loose, unfocused attention of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. He passed through neighborhoods he didn't usually pass through. He stopped once at a red light and sat there for several seconds after it turned green until the car behind him reminded him to move. He was thinking about 4 years of dinners at the Sterling table. He was thinking about the way Elena used to sit at the far end and listen to his mother hold court and never not once betray by any visible expression what she actually thought of what she was hearing. He was thinking about the times he had caught her in the library in the early mornings, reading with the concentrated absorption of someone who read, the way other people breathed, not for entertainment, not for improvement, but because it was simply what her mind required to function. He had always known she was intelligent. He had known it the way you know something you have filed away in a category labeled irrelevant, which is the most dangerous kind of knowing, because it lets you acknowledge the truth without acting on it. He was thinking about what it meant that a woman with a $47 billion empire had spent 4 years sitting at his dinner table being called a placeholder by his mother, and had not once given any indication that she was anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. The discipline of that, the patience of it, the loneliness. He had asked her if she had ever loved him, and she had said yes, and he believed her, and he was not sure whether believing her made it better or worse. He thought it probably made it worse. He got home at 5:30. His mother was waiting. Beatrice Sterling had spent the afternoon in a state of escalating alarm that she was managing in her characteristic way by converting it into forward motion making calls, demanding updates, instructing her personal assistant to find out what was happening with the New York meeting in terms that made clear she expected answers immediately. She had not gotten them because Richard had told Franklin to hold all communication until they were back. And Franklin, for once in 11 years, had followed an instruction he disagreed with. So Beatrice had been waiting with no information for 6 hours, and she was not by temperament or practice a woman who waited well. She heard Mark's car in the drive, and she was at the door before he reached it. "Tell me," she said. Mark walked past her into the house. He went to the study. He sat down in his father's old chair, the heavy leather one that had always felt when he was a child like sitting inside authority itself, and he looked at his mother and he told her. He told her everything. The debt, the $412 million, the 4 vehicles and the single entity controlling them all, the mortgage on the house, the manufacturing facilities, the execution documents signed at 3 o'clock that afternoon in a boardroom on the 43rd floor of a midtown Manhattan building. He told her who sat at the head of that table. Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the study and listened, and the color in her face went through several changes that Mark had never seen on his mother's face before. She had always been, whatever her considerable faults, a woman of formidable composure. The composure did not fail all at once. It failed the way a structure fails under weight. It was not designed to carry slowly at first. Then suddenly the integrity going out of it in stages, until there was nothing left holding the shape. "That is not possible," she said. Her voice was entirely flat. Elena did not, she couldn't have. She did, Mother. She was nobody. She was a nobody from nowhere with nothing. I checked. When Mark first brought her home, I had her checked. I had a firm look into her background, and they found— "What firm?" Mark said. Beatrice stopped. "What firm did you use? What did you ask them to look for?" He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not anger, something older and more tired than anger. "Because Elena Vance has been operating Vantage Global for 11 years. It is not a new company. It is not a small company. If your firm found nothing, Mother, it is because they looked for the wrong things, or because they were not very good, or because Elena's structure was designed specifically to be invisible to exactly that kind of search." Beatrice sat down. She sat down heavily, which was something Mark had never seen her do. Beatrice Sterling did not sit down heavily. She arranged herself. She composed herself into chairs. Tonight she simply sat, and the difference was enormous. "The house," she said, "is held under mortgage by a bank that Vantage acquired in February. She owns our house, the mortgage on our house. There's a distinction, and she has offered terms that allow you to stay here for your lifetime. That offer is part of the executed agreement." Beatrice looked at her son. Something moved through her expression that Mark had almost never seen. There's something that might in another woman have been described as fear. In Beatrice, it presented more as a radical disorientation, the look of a person whose map of the world has just been revealed to be entirely wrong. "She sat at my table," Beatrice said slowly. "For 4 years. She sat at my table and she listened to me and she..." She stopped. She never argued. She never defended herself. I said things to that woman that I would not repeat now. And she looked at me and said nothing, and I thought it was because she had nothing to say. I know, Mark said. She was listening. She was watching the entire time. Yes. Beatrice put her hand over her mouth. It was a gesture Mark had never seen from her in his life. He felt watching it something complicated, not satisfaction, because this was his mother, and whatever she had done, and however she had driven the decisions that led to this afternoon, she was his mother, and he was not built to feel satisfaction at her pain. But he felt something adjacent to it, a recognition, perhaps, that the reckoning was proportionate, that the architecture of consequences was in this case sound. She offered fair terms, Mark said. Richard and Franklin both reviewed them. We signed them. The company will be restructured under Vantage management. The employees keep their jobs. The legacy, the manufacturing process, the brand history that survives in the successor entity. We retain a small equity position. He paused. It is better than we deserved. Beatrice looked at him sharply. Better than we deserved, Mark. We humiliated her at your birthday party, he said, in front of 300 people. We served her divorce papers like it was a performance. You laughed, Mother. You stood there and you laughed, and you called her a placeholder. He said it without heat, but without flinching either. She held $400 million of our debt, and she offered us fair terms, and she told me she had no interest in putting you on the street. That is not what we would have done. So yes, better than we deserved. Beatrice said nothing. For the first time in Mark Sterling's adult life, his mother had absolutely nothing to say. He left her there and went upstairs, and the house settled around him with the particular quiet of a place that understands something is ending. 3 weeks after the signing, the financial press got the story. Not the personal dimension that came later. First, it was the business story, which was extraordinary enough on its own terms. Vantage Global's acquisition of Sterling Textile's consolidated debt and the subsequent restructuring was reported first in a trade publication that covered private equity transactions, then picked up by 2 financial newspapers, and then, because the numbers were striking and the narrative of a quiet empire absorbing a declining dynasty had a clean, dramatic shape that general readers could follow, it moved into the mainstream financial press. Elena did not comment. Vantage Global's public relations team issued a standard statement confirming the transaction and declined to discuss details. This was their consistent practice, and it served them well. But someone talked. It was never entirely clear who Franklin Brace denied it. Richard denied it, the Vantage team denied it, and Elena herself certainly had no reason to accelerate a disclosure she had not yet decided to make. The most likely source, ultimately, was one of the guests from the birthday gala, who had been present for the divorce papers and had subsequently connected the dots when the Vantage Global story appeared and noticed, as sharp-eyed people do, that the founding principal shared a name with the quiet woman who had been handed an envelope at Beatrice Sterling's party. However once it started, it moved fast. By the 4th week after the signing, the personal story had overtaken the business story entirely. The version that circulated in social media, in the society columns, in the particular whisper network of the East Coast upper class, where the Sterling family had spent generations maintaining their position, was substantially accurate, which was unusual, and for the Sterlings worse than if it had been exaggerated. An exaggerated story could be disputed. The truth in this case was its own indictment. The woman they had humiliated at the birthday party was the founder of Vantage Global. She had been throughout her 4-year marriage to Mark Sterling, the controlling creditor of their company and the ultimate holder of the mortgage on their estate. She had offered them fair terms in the restructuring. She had left the marriage with her dignity intact and her empire undiminished. They had called her a placeholder. The story spread the way only genuinely extraordinary stories spread organically, person by person, with the particular momentum of a narrative that feels to everyone who hears it like something they were waiting to hear. It confirmed something people wanted, confirmed that quiet people sometimes know exactly what they are doing, that the woman being laughed at in the corner sometimes owns the building. Maya monitored the coverage and sent Elena a daily summary. Elena read the summaries with the focused attention she brought to all information and made no public response. She was not by nature or by practice a person who performed her victories. She had made the decisions she made, executed the strategy she had built, and the story was the story. She did not need to add to it. But there was one thing she had decided to add. She had been thinking about it since the morning of the boardroom meeting, since the moment she had walked out of that room and the doors had closed behind her, and she had stood in the elevator going down and thought about the shape of what had happened, and what, if anything, was still owed not to the Sterlings, but to the truth, to the 300 people who had watched a woman be handed an envelope and laughed about a book, to the broader world in which powerful women were routinely invisible until the moment they were suddenly unavoidable. She thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything, and she came to a decision. The Harrington Foundation Gala was the most significant social event of the East Coast philanthropic calendar. 400 guests, black tie, the kind of room that contained reliably the people who shaped opinion in finance, politics, culture, and media. Elena had attended it 3 times in the past as herself as Elena Vance Vantage Global, a significant donor to the Foundation's education and workforce development initiatives. She was known there, respected there, among people who had never once crossed paths with the version of her that Mark Sterling had married. She confirmed her attendance 6 weeks after the signing. She wore a gown the color of deep gold. She arrived with Jeffrey at her left and Christine at her right, and she moved through the room with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own skin, which she was, which she had always been, which was perhaps the truest thing about her. The Sterlings had also been invited. They had almost declined. Richard had argued for declining. Mark had overruled him for reasons he did not fully articulate, but that had something to do with the conversation he'd had with himself in the week since the signing, the ongoing difficult conversation about what it meant to face things rather than retreat from them. Beatrice had insisted on attending with a ferocity that was its own kind of denial, because Beatrice Sterling was not yet capable of processing what had happened except as a misfortune to be weathered rather than a consequence to be understood. They arrived separately from Elena and did not know she would be there. Mark saw her first from across the room, and the recognition went through him in a single clean wave. She was laughing at something Jeffrey had said, and the laugh was unguarded, and he understood in that moment that in 4 years of marriage he had rarely seen her laugh like that with her whole face, without any of the careful social monitoring she had maintained inside the Sterling world. He was seeing from 30 feet away at a gala where he no longer controlled anything, the version of Elena that had always existed behind the version he'd been allowed to see. He turned away before she saw him. He took a glass of water from a passing tray and stood with Richard and tried to have a conversation about something that didn't matter. Beatrice across the room was not so controlled. She had spotted Elena within 4 minutes of arriving, and the spotting had produced a visible reaction, a stiffening, a sharp intake of breath, a hand tightening on her clutch that Patricia Veen, standing next to her, noticed immediately and catalogued for later distribution. "Beatrice," Patricia said with the particular solicitousness of a woman who has spent decades at these events and knows exactly what a social crisis looks like when it's beginning. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Beatrice said. The word came out wrong. Elena had been watching the room with the peripheral awareness of someone who always knew where everyone was, and she had registered Beatrice's arrival and Mark's arrival and had made her assessment of the situation with the speed she applied to most assessments. She had not planned this specific encounter, but she had known it was probable, and she had decided what she would do if it occurred. She crossed the room, not toward Beatrice, not toward Mark, toward the small group nearest the center of the space, which happened to include 3 of the most influential people in the room: Senator Catherine Doyle, media executive, Harper Langston, and Dorian Graves, whose venture capital firm had co-invested with Vantage on 2 occasions. She moved into that conversation naturally, easily, and within 2 minutes she was the center of it, not by performing centrality, but by saying things worth listening to, which was always how she had operated. The room, which had been watching from the moment she entered, watched this. Beatrice watched it too. Harper Langston, who ran the 3rd largest media company on the East Coast and whose nose for a story was professional and unerring, had already connected the dots. He had read the financial press. He had heard the social circuit version. He was looking at Elena Vance in a gold gown, commanding the attention of a senator and a room full of the most influential people in the city, and he was thinking about narrative, because that was what he always thought about. He leaned toward Elena during a pause in the conversation and said quietly enough that only she could hear, There's a story here that I think people should know. Elena looked at him. There are many stories, she said. Most of them belong to the people who lived them. And this one, she was quiet for a moment. She looked across the room, not at Mark, not at Beatrice, but at the room itself, at the 400 people who represented in their various ways the world in which she operated. She thought about dignity. She thought about the 300 people who had laughed at the book. She thought about every woman who had ever sat at a table where her value was being determined by people who had not thought to ask what she had built. This one, she said, can be told accurately. Harper Langston smiled. Dinner, next week. My editorial director will be there. Have Maya schedule it. The conversation moved on, but the decision had been made. 40 minutes into the evening, the Foundation's director called for attention and made the announcement he had been planning for 6 weeks, which was that Vantage Global had committed $30 million to the Foundation's National Education Initiative, the single largest gift in the Foundation's history, designated specifically for workforce development programs in communities where manufacturing employment had declined. The announcement was met with sustained applause, and Elena accepted it with the composed warmth of someone who gave because she believed in the giving which she did. From across the room, Mark Sterling heard the number and felt something he could not immediately name. $30 million given publicly to a program designed to help the communities most affected by exactly the kind of industrial decline that had consumed his family's company. He thought about Sterling Textiles employees, the 230 people whose jobs Elena's restructuring terms had specifically preserved. He thought about what she had said in the boardroom, none of whom are responsible for how this family managed its finances. He set down his glass and walked across the room. He did not plan it. His body simply decided the way bodies sometimes decide, before the mind has finished its debate, that this was something that needed to happen. Elena saw him coming. She tracked him with the peripheral awareness that never fully turned off, and she measured his approach, his pace, his posture, his expression, and made her determination about what kind of conversation this was. She excused herself from her group with the ease of someone who had been excusing herself from groups gracefully for years, and turned to meet him. They stood facing each other in the middle of the room with 400 people around them, and the particular gravity of two people who have said most of what needs to be said and are now in the territory of what remains. That announcement, Mark said, the $30 million, the workforce program. Yes. The communities it covers. That includes the towns where our factories operate. Yes. That's... He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely beyond strategy, beyond social management, into something undefended and genuine. That's for our people, the factory workers. You're doing that for our people. They were never your people in the way you mean it, Elena said, not unkindly. They were people who worked at a company you happen to own. They are people with families and mortgages and children in school, and they did their jobs faithfully for years, while the people at the top of the company made decisions that put their livelihoods at risk. Yes, I am doing that for them. Mark nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, what he said was, "You are a remarkable person. I don't think I ever told you that when it would have mattered. I'm telling you now." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "I know what I am," she said. "I always did. The question was whether you could see it." She held his gaze. "You couldn't, and it's not unforgivable. But it was the end of us. That was always going to be the end of us." She said it without anger and without softness, with the clarity that had always been her truest quality. Then Beatrice Sterling appeared at Mark's shoulder, and the clarity became something else. Beatrice had spent 40 minutes working herself up to this. She had spent those 40 minutes watching Elena own this room the way she had never been allowed to own the Sterling dining table, and something in Beatrice had passed through denial and emerged on the other side into a country she had no map for. She was not a woman who apologized. She had never been a woman who apologized. But she was also beneath all the armor she had built over 65 years. A woman who was capable of understanding when she had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. She stood next to her son, and she looked at Elena Vance and she said, "I owe you something." Elena waited. "What I said to you, at the party, placeholder." Beatrice's voice was controlled with visible effort. It was cruel. And it was stupid, which is worse. I judged you by measures that had nothing to do with your actual worth, and I was wrong. Comprehensively." She stopped, breathed. "I am telling you this not because I expect anything from it. I am telling you because it is true, and because you deserve to hear it, said plainly by the person who said the other thing plainly in front of 300 people. The room near them had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real is happening. Elena looked at Beatrice Sterling at the effort it had cost this woman to say those words, at the architecture of a lifetime of pride that had been required to partially dismantle itself to produce them. She felt looking at her something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. Something that acknowledged the humanity of a person who had done harm and was now in her own limited way trying to account for it. "I hear you," Elena said. "Thank you for saying it." It was not absolution. It was not warmth. It was the truth of what Elena could honestly offer, which was that she had heard the words and she acknowledged the effort behind them. It was enough. Beatrice nodded once with the dignity of a woman accepting a verdict she had earned and walked away. Mark watched his mother go. He looked at Elena one last time. He said, "Take care of yourself." "I always have," she said. He walked away. The conversation around them resumed. The evening continued. Harper Langston from across the room had watched the entire exchange with the professional attention of a man who understood that he had just witnessed the concluding chapter of a story that was going to be told for a very long time. Elena accepted another glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and turned back toward Jeffrey and Christine and the conversation about the Chicago acquisition that had been waiting for her. She was already thinking forward. She was always thinking forward, but somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept the things that mattered, without letting them interfere with the work she was also holding. Something quiet and settled the knowledge that she had walked into this evening as herself, entirely herself for the first time in 4 years, and that the room had responded to her exactly as it should have. Not to what she owned, not to what she had done to the Sterling family, to who she was. That was what she had tested in the beginning with Mark Sterling. That was what she had needed to know. She knew it now, not from him, but from herself, which was, she thought, turning back to Jeffrey, with something that was finally, unmistakably, a genuine smile, probably where she should have been looking all along. The Harper Langston story ran on a Thursday morning in the first week of November, 14 weeks after the Harrington Gala, and by noon it had been read by more people than anything his publication had run in the previous 2 years. He had written it himself, which he rarely did anymore. He had written it because he understood from the moment he watched Elena Vance accept an apology from Beatrice Sterling in the middle of 400 people without flinching that this was not a story you handed to someone else. He had taken 6 weeks to report it properly, speaking to people who had been at the birthday gala, to former Sterling Textiles employees, to financial analysts who had been tracking Vantage Global's growth for years without fully understanding who was behind it. He had sent Elena a draft through Maya as a professional courtesy, and Elena had returned it with 2 factual corrections and no other changes, which told him everything he needed to know about her relationship with the truth. The headline was simple. It read, "The woman they called a placeholder built a $47 billion empire. They just didn't think to ask." By 3 o'clock that Thursday afternoon, the story had been shared across every major social platform more than 200,000 times. By Friday morning, it was being discussed on 3 national morning television programs. By the following Monday, it had been picked up by publications in 11 countries, translated into 6 languages, and had generated a cultural conversation that far exceeded anything the financial transaction itself had produced. The reason was simple, and Elena understood it immediately when Maya showed her the engagement numbers on Friday morning. The story was not really about private equity or debt instruments or corporate restructuring. The story was about a woman who had been looked at by the people closest to her and seen as nothing, and had responded by becoming undeniable. That story was not new. But it was told rarely with this much specificity, this much documentation, this much clean and irrefutable evidence that the woman in question had known exactly what she was doing every single moment. People responded to it the way people respond to things that confirm something they have always believed, but rarely seen confirmed so completely. Maya sat across from Elena in the real office on Friday morning and read her the comment sections from 3 different platforms, which was not something she usually did, because Elena did not typically find comment sections useful. Today was different. Today, Maya read them because the volume and the consistency of what people were saying warranted attention, and because Elena, who made all her decisions on the basis of complete information, needed to understand what the story had become in the world. 43-year-old woman from Ohio, Maya read, wrote, "I have sat at tables where I was called nothing, and I have kept building anyway. This woman is every woman who ever kept building anyway." Elena looked at her coffee cup. Teacher from Atlanta? Wrote, "I showed this to my daughter, who is 17, and told her this is what dignity looks like when it has done its homework." Elena was quiet. Retired factory worker from Western Massachusetts. Wrote, "I worked at Sterling Textiles for 22 years. When Vantage took over, we all thought we were finished. Instead, they kept every single one of us. I did not know until today who was responsible for that. Now I do." Elena set down her coffee cup. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to Maya, and Maya, who knew her better than almost anyone, gave her that moment without filling it. When Elena turned back, her expression was composed, but her eyes were bright in a way that was not her usual register. "The factory worker," she said. "Get his name. I want to send a letter, a real one on paper." Maya was already writing. "And the Education Initiative announcement, I want the first cohort details released today. Not next week, today. The story is in the room. Use it." "Already drafted," Maya said. "Waiting for your approval." Elena approved it in 4 minutes, made one change to the language about eligibility requirements, and sent it back. By afternoon, the announcement of the first cohort of the Vantage Global Workforce Development Program, 230 participants, the exact number of Sterling Textiles employees retained in the restructuring, which was not a coincidence, and which several journalists noticed immediately, was generating its own wave of coverage. Elena did 2 interviews that week. She had never done interviews before, or almost never. Vantage Global's growth had been built in deliberate obscurity, and she had always preferred the power of the unseen position to the vulnerability of the visible one. But the story was already out, and the choice now was not whether to be visible, but what to do with the visibility. She chose carefully. One financial publication for the audience that would carry the business credibility. One general interest magazine with a readership that skewed toward the demographic she most wanted to reach: women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who had spent careers being underestimated, and who were, she suspected, the people responding most deeply to the Thursday story. In both interviews, she was precise, warm, and completely in control of what she gave and what she kept. She did not perform humility. She did not perform triumph. She spoke about the company she had built with the directness of someone who had built it through work rather than luck, and saw no reason to apologize for either the work or the result. She spoke about the Workforce Development Initiative with the specificity of someone who had thought hard about what it meant to use capital in service of something real. She spoke about the marriage minimally cleanly, without cruelty, and without concealment, as a chapter of her life that had told her something important about what she valued and what she would not accept. In the financial interview, the journalist asked her directly, "Did you know when you began accumulating Sterling Textiles debt that you would end up in a boardroom across from your husband?" Elena considered the question for exactly as long as it deserved. "I knew that the debt was sound and the position was available and the underlying business had value that its current management was failing to realize," she said. "Everything else was context." The journalist smiled. "That's a very clean answer." "It's a true answer," Elena said. "Clean and true are not always the same thing. In this case, they happen to be." The piece ran with that exchange as the pull quote. In the weeks after the story broke, the people who had been at Beatrice Sterling's birthday party had their own private reckoning with what they had witnessed and how they had responded to it. Claudia Marsh, who had said, "Is that really a book with the inability to help herself that she would spend the next several years regretting?" sent Elena a handwritten note that was 3 paragraphs of genuine contrition and 1 paragraph of explanation that she then crossed out and rewrote twice before sending. Elena read it, acknowledged it with a brief and gracious reply, and did not think about it again. Patricia Veen, who had been standing next to Beatrice at the gala when Beatrice spotted Elena and whose social observational memory was comprehensive and detailed, gave a lunch interview to a Society column in which she said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had always privately found the Sterling family's treatment of Elena uncomfortable, that she had never once believed the quiet wife was as unremarkable as the family insisted, and that the outcome was, in her view, entirely unsurprising. This was not entirely accurate, but it was the version Patricia needed to tell, and Elena, when Maya flagged the article, said simply, "Leave it." Mark Sterling read the Harper Langston story on the Thursday it ran, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment he now rented in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a two-bedroom on the third floor of a building that cost $1,400 a month and contained in its entirety less square footage than the Sterling estate's smaller sitting room. He had been living there for 8 weeks. He had taken a position at a mid-size consulting firm that had been a client of Sterling Textiles for years and had offered him work out of a combination of genuine respect for his operational knowledge and the particular mercy that people sometimes extend to the fallen when the falling has been thorough enough to eliminate any threat. He was good at the work. He was better at it, actually, than he had ever been at running the family company. Because the family company had never required him to be good, it had required him to maintain, and maintenance and excellence are different skills. He read the story through once quickly, and then again slowly, the way he had started reading things since the boardroom meeting, with the attention he had previously reserved for documents that cost him money now applied to everything that might cost him understanding. He read the part about the factory worker from Western Massachusetts, and he sat with that for a long time. He thought about 230 people keeping their jobs because of terms Elena had insisted on in a restructuring that she could have executed far more brutally, and that no one, not Franklin, not Richard, not any of the financial journalists who had covered the transaction, had understood at the time was an act of deliberate generosity rather than standard practice. He had not understood it either. He was understanding it now. He thought about what that said about her. He thought about what it said about him, that it had taken him this long. He called Richard. Richard answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call, or at least not surprised by it. "I read it," Richard said before Mark could say anything. "I know. She protected our people, Mark. She didn't have to do that. The terms she offered us, she could have liquidated everything. She had the instruments to do it. Franklin told me afterward that a standard enforcement action would have returned more value to the creditor than what she actually executed. I know. She left money on the table to keep people employed. I know, Richard." A silence. Then Richard said, with the quiet precision of a man who has been thinking about something for some time and has finally decided to say it, "She was the best thing that ever happened to this family, and we treated her like an inconvenience." Mark said nothing. "Mother knows it too," Richard said. "She won't say it in those words, but she knows it. You can tell. She's been different. Since the gala, since Elena accepted what she said. I think it was the accepting that did it. Mother expected anger. Elena just acknowledged it and moved on, and I think that hit Mother harder than anger would have." "Yes," Mark said. "I think it would. They talked for another 20 minutes about things that weren't Elena, the consulting work, Richard's wife, the small equity position in the Vantage successor entity that was against all expectation, showing early signs of performing well under new management. They talked about their grandfather. They talked about what it meant to rebuild something when the original structure was gone. It was the most honest conversation they had had in years, possibly ever. Mark worked late that evening and came home to his apartment and stood in the kitchen making dinner, an actual dinner from ingredients, which was something he had learned to do in the past 8 weeks and had discovered with some surprise that he was not bad at. And he thought about the version of himself that had stood in a ballroom 61 weeks ago and thrown an envelope at a woman and called her a burden. He thought about who that man had been. Not a villain. He had spent enough time with himself now to resist the temptation of simple self-condemnation, which was its own kind of avoidance. He had been a man who had substituted his family's judgment for his own for so long that he had lost the ability to tell the difference between what he genuinely valued and what he had been taught to value. He had been a man who had looked at something extraordinary and seen only what his mother's categories allowed him to see. He was trying now to develop his own categories. It was harder than it sounded, and it was the most important work he had ever done. 2 years passed. They pass the way years pass when you are rebuilding something not quickly, not easily, but with the particular steadiness of forward motion that comes from having nothing left to protect except your own integrity. Mark Sterling rebuilt himself the way his grandfather had built the original company, one decision at a time, with less certainty than he used to carry and more honesty than he used to allow. He was good at the consulting work, and he was promoted once and then again, and the second promotion came with a team of 12 people who reported to him and whom he managed with a care and attention that surprised them because the Sterling name, to the extent they knew it, suggested a man of inherited ease rather than earned consideration. He surprised them regularly. He found he preferred that to the alternative. Beatrice Sterling lived in the estate under the terms Elena had negotiated. She lived there quietly, which was the word everyone used now when they talked about her quietly, carefully, in a way that acknowledged without announcing that the world she had understood herself to occupy no longer existed in the form she had known it. She was not broken. She was at 67, a woman who had been forced to understand that the architecture of her own certainty had been built on a foundation that had never been as solid as she believed, and she was doing what she could with that understanding. She called Mark on Sundays. She asked about his work with a genuine interest she had not previously shown in anything he built for himself rather than for the family. She did not talk about Elena. She did not need to. Elena Vance in those same 2 years did not slow down. She accelerated. The Workforce Development Initiative expanded from its initial 230 participants to a national program operating in 31 cities, funded by a dedicated philanthropic arm of Vantage Global, that Elena capitalized with $150 million in its first full year of operation. The program became, within 18 months, the most cited example in policy discussions about private sector investment in workforce transition. And Elena testified before a Senate subcommittee on economic development with the same calm precision she brought to every boardroom, and was asked by Senator Catherine Doyle whether she thought her approach could be replicated by other private equity firms. Any firm that chooses to, Elena said. It requires deciding that the communities where you operate are stakeholders, not externalities. It requires believing that your obligation doesn't end at the return on investment. She paused. It also requires having enough capital to absorb the short-term cost, which is a real barrier and one that policy could address. But the will has to come first. Senator Doyle later said in an interview that it was the most useful 3 hours she had spent in a subcommittee room in 6 years. Julian Thorne came into Elena's life in the way that significant things tend to come into the lives of very busy people sideways, without announcement during a meeting about something else entirely. He was the CEO of a renewable energy infrastructure company that had been quietly, methodically building a portfolio of projects across the Southeast, and Vantage Global had been considering a co-investment for 18 months when Elena finally took the meeting herself rather than delegating it. She had been intending to delegate it. She had 3 reasons not to, and 1 instinct that she should, and she had learned over 11 years of building Vantage to pay attention to her instincts. Julian Thorne was direct in the way that people are direct when they have spent enough time in rooms where indirection wasted everyone's time, and learned to prefer the alternative. He was serious without being heavy. He was funny in the specific way of someone who found the world genuinely interesting, rather than performing the finding. He asked Elena 40 minutes into the meeting a question about the Workforce Development Program that demonstrated he had read not just the public coverage, but the Senate testimony and the academic analysis that had been published about the program's methodology, and he asked it with the curiosity of someone who wanted to understand rather than to impress. Elena answered him. Then she asked him a question back. The meeting ran 90 minutes over its scheduled time and ended without a decision on the co-investment, which Jeffrey noted afterward was unusual. "We should probably schedule a follow-up," Elena said, not looking at him. "Already sent the invitation," Jeffrey said, also not looking at her. The co-investment was finalized 4 months later. By then, Elena and Julian had had 11 dinners, 2 arguments about infrastructure policy that had each lasted longer than the dinners, and 1 conversation about his daughter from his first marriage that had lasted until 2 in the morning and had told Elena everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. He was the kind of man who, when his daughter called him at 10 o'clock at night in distress about something at school, excused himself from dinner without apology and came back 40 minutes later and said simply, "She's all right. I'm sorry. Where were we?" He was the kind of man who remembered 3 weeks after Elena mentioned that she had spent 3 months finding a rare book for a woman who left it on a table, to send her an article he had come across about the auction history of 19th century botanical illustrations with a note that said, "Only thought you'd find this interesting." He was the kind of man who asked what she thought and then actually listened to the answer. Elena noticed all of this with the attention she applied to everything. She did not rush toward it. She did not retreat from it. She let it be what it was, which was real, and she walked toward it with open eyes and the full knowledge of who she was and what she had built and what she required from the person who would stand beside it. They were married on a Saturday in late April, 3.5 years after the night Elena walked out of a ballroom into the rain and made a phone call that began the end of everything the Sterling family had believed about themselves. The ceremony was small, 40 people a venue in the Hudson Valley Maya, in the second row, with the expression of a woman who has waited a long time for something right to happen and is allowing herself to feel the full weight of its arrival. Jeffrey gave a toast that was 4 minutes long and contained 2 genuinely funny observations about Elena's relationship with her calendar and 1 genuinely moving observation about the quality of a person who could hold power without letting it harden her. Julian held her hand through the toast and laughed at the right moments and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who understands he is in the presence of something remarkable and is not threatened by it but enlarged by it. That expression, that was the thing Elena had been looking for. Not wealth, not status, not the performance of devotion, the willingness to look at who she actually was and be enlarged by it rather than diminished. She had found it. It had taken longer than it should have and cost more than it should have, and had required her to walk through a ballroom in front of 300 people who were laughing about a book, and sign her name on a line, and step out into the rain, and begin again. It had been worth every moment of it. The daughter, Julian's daughter Sophia, who was 11 when Elena met her, and 13 at the wedding and possessed of her father's directness and her late mother's humor, in a combination that Elena found immediately entirely compelling, stood next to her father during the ceremony, and afterward found Elena at the edge of the reception and said with the unfiltered assessment of a 13-year-old who had decided to reserve judgment until she had enough information, "You're not what I expected." Elena looked at her. "What did you expect?" Sophia considered. "Someone more, I don't know. More like a boss. You read like a boss online." "I am a boss," Elena said. "Yeah, but you're also—" Sophia searched for the word. "Normal. Like you're normal at the same time." Elena smiled, and it was the unguarded smile, the one she had worn at the Harrington Gala when Jeffrey made her laugh and Mark Sterling had seen it from across the room and understood what he had never been given. "Thank you," she said. "That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me today." Sophia looked pleased with herself and went back to the dance floor, and Elena watched her go and felt something settle in her chest, something warm and permanent and entirely unlike anything the Sterling years had offered her. This was the life, this here. This was what she had been building toward without fully knowing it, not the empire, not the restructuring, not the boardroom moment or the gala or the magazine covers. This Saturday in April, with 40 people who actually knew her, and a man who saw her clearly and was glad of what he saw, and a 13-year-old who had just called her normal as a compliment, and meant it entirely. 3 months after the wedding on a Tuesday evening, Mark Sterling was sitting in his Cambridge apartment eating the pasta he had learned to make and watching the news when Elena's face appeared on the television screen. She was being profiled on a national evening program, a 15-minute segment about the Workforce Development Initiative, which had just been cited by the Department of Labor as the most effective private sector workforce program operating in the country. She was sitting across from the interviewer with the composed warmth that was her actual register, the one she had never been given space to show at the Sterling dinner table, and she was talking about the factory workers in Western Massachusetts. and what it meant to build something that outlasted the transaction it came from. Mark set down his fork. He watched the whole 15 minutes. He watched Julian Thorne appear briefly at the end in footage from a joint press event for the infrastructure company. A tall man with an easy smile, who stood next to Elena with the natural ease of someone who had no need to perform proximity to her importance, because he was entirely comfortable with his own. The interviewer at the end asked Elena what she wanted people to understand about her story. Elena thought about it for a moment. She said, "I want people to understand that being underestimated is not the same as being limited. And I want women especially to understand that the room where people laugh at you is not the room that defines you. The room that defines you is the one you build yourself." Mark Sterling sat in his apartment and watched the television, and the pasta went cold. He understood it now, not partially, not with the hedges and self-protections that had clouded his understanding in the boardroom at the gala in the long, difficult months after. He understood it completely, which was a different and considerably more demanding experience. He understood that he had held something extraordinary in his hands for 4 years and had looked at it through his mother's eyes instead of his own and had seen nothing, and that the woman on his television screen had known this and had stayed anyway for 4 years, hoping to be wrong, and had signed the papers without argument when she finally understood she was not wrong, and had then gone out into the rain and called a man named Jeffrey and said, "Begin Monday," and had built from that phone call everything that was now spreading across his television screen in 15 minutes of national coverage. He understood that he had not lost her because of money. He had never lost her because of money. The money was never the point. The money was just the form her reality took when it could no longer be hidden. He had lost her because in 4 years of marriage, he had never once looked at her, really looked with his own eyes, through no one else's categories, and asked himself who she actually was. That was the loss. That was where it had happened. That was the mistake he was spending the rest of his life learning not to repeat. He picked up his fork. He finished his pasta. He washed the dish and put it away, and went to his desk and worked for another 2 hours on a project he actually believed in, for a team of 12 people he actually cared about, in a life that was smaller than the one he had been born into and more honest than anything he had ever managed before. Elena Vance, Elena Thorne. Now, though, the professional name stayed Vance, because the professional name was what she had built, and she had never needed a man's name to tell her who she was. Put her daughter to sleep that same Tuesday night. Sophia, having declared herself too old for bedtime stories, but not, it turned out, too old for talking in the dark about school and friendships and what it meant to be good at something and still be uncertain about other things. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and answered every question with the honesty she had always believed children deserved more than comfort. And when Sophia finally fell asleep, she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the small person breathing in the dark and felt the full weight of everything that had led to this room. Julian was reading when she came to bed. He looked up. He read her face with the ease of someone who had learned to read it and said, "Good talk." She asked me if I was ever afraid of failing. "What did you say?" Elena sat down. She thought about it. She thought about a ballroom and a signed envelope and a rainy night and a phone call and 11 years of building and a boardroom and a gala and a gold dress and a Saturday in April. She thought about Sophia asking if she was afraid and what the true answer was. "I told her I was afraid every single day," she said, "and that I did it anyway, and that doing it anyway was the whole thing. That was the whole answer." Julian looked at her with that expression, the one that enlarged rather than diminished. "That's the whole answer," he agreed. She turned off the light. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday night, indifferent and continuous. And inside that apartment, Elena Vance lived the life she had chosen and built, and earned not by being fearless, not by being perfect, not by being what anyone else had decided she should be, by being fully and finally and without apology exactly who she was. That was the empire that mattered. That was the one no one could take from her. That was the one she had been building all along.